Greetings, I am SupernovaBlade, and welcome to the 5th Stories in History of SupernovaBlade video. For this episode, I wanted to talk about something I have had on my mind for a bit of time. Today's topic, podcasts. So, for this episode, I am just going to be talking about my experiences with podcasts, or lack thereof, which I will explain later. But first, I need to go back to how I first learned of the existences of podcasts. I first learned about podcasts when I was in elementary school. I forgot a lot of the context of what exactly was the reason we were talking about podcasts, but I think I have a good guess as to why. We were learning about how to use GarageBand, and there was a separate section for recording podcasts and the like. Despite that part being kinda fuzzy, I do remember that we had an assignment that was to make a small wrap of the podcast feature in GarageBand about, of all things, multiplication by multiples of 3. But before that, we had something else we were doing with the podcast function of GarageBand. It was just a small little test that was assigned by our technology teacher. We were assigned to read out, of all things, the American Pledge of Allegiance, all in unison. So, we did. Anyway, back onto the rap about multiplying by 3, we all had to create our own raps, and if we wanted to, we could present them in front of the class for everyone to listen, and potentially, they could be chosen for the class's assignment. I remember raising my hand and standing up in front of the class and saying multiples of 3 from 3 to 99 in a rhythmic tone. Once everybody who wanted to present presented, the rest of the class got to vote on whose rap would be chosen. Long story short, I voted for myself, and almost everybody voted for someone else in the class. Everyone chose this person who I'm just going to call Jay. That wasn't his full name, but that's what I'm going to be calling him for this video. Anyway, Jay and I were actually really good friends, and he seemed rather confident in the project. He was a rather popular person in the class. Very social, easy to talk to, and a good friend. For his rap, he would give 4 multiples of 3 and then a word that rhymes with the last number he said in the verse. Like 24, more, 36, sick. At least, I'm pretty sure that was what he did. Again, this was over a decade ago, and things are rather fuzzy. But ever since, my multiples song from 399 was dropped, and it would never come back up ever again. So, enough pointless background information about how everyone loves Jay, now on to how this relates to podcasts. With Jay's rap chosen for the project, we had a new project. We would use the podcast feature in GarageBand to record ourselves singing Jay's multiple of 3 rap. It was pretty much what you'd expect from a bunch of 9-year-olds trying to sing a rap together. Yeah, that wasn't even a podcast. That's more of an acapella, but that's actually it for that story. On to the next story. If I'm honest, I have not really been much of a podcast listener, but if I'm given an assignment to listen to a podcast, I'm not going to complain about it, and I'll do it. However, sometimes I wondered, if I were to be on a podcast, what would I talk about, and what would that theme be? Most of my exposure of listening to podcasts are from other people, especially my mother. My mother is a very avid podcast listener, or at least she was when she was still having to commute to and from work before the lockdown 20 happened. She listened to podcasts about stuff like Harry Potter, to true murder, to infectious diseases. I have also had school assignments where I had to listen to podcasts about psychological theory, and how humans are so careless to the earth, and a few others that are so insignificant I completely blocked them out of my memory. However, there was one instance that was kind of the main reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. I have one story that immediately comes to my mind when I think about my experiences, or lack thereof, of podcasts. This happened around the fall of the year of the Panini, as someone who I watched described it. Basically, 2 of my friends at the time who were dating came up with an idea where they could make a podcast where they talk about various different topics. Again, for future use for later in the story, because I don't want to say their actual names or usernames, kind of similar to what I did with Jay, I'm just gonna be using semi-anonymous names so that they don't bleed me dry or find out that I'm talking about them. So the names I'm going to give them are Jake and Karina. Anyway, Jake and Karina ran this podcast where they talked about random topics of their choice. The podcast started somewhere in either September or October of my final year of high school. They started their podcast with a simple welcome episode to start off the podcast to everyone. Since this was around the end of the year, it was around the time of a lot of holidays such as Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. Other episode topics I remember Jake and Karina tackling were stuff like differing tastes in music, since one was a metalhead and the other loved K-pop, and also stuff like anime and the sort. However, after a bit of time, they ran out of topics to talk about, and they were also realizing that they wanted to bring their community together. Around Christmas of that year, they managed to partner up with a charity organization to donate money to children whom, without our support, wouldn't be able to have Christmas presents in such an unprecedented time. As many other charity events, they had specific milestones for when they reached a specific amount of money, and I actually got to participate in giving the two of them cursed profile pictures on Discord. I chose to give them King for Another Day Thanos, and the other Thanos Big Chungus. Don't believe me? Here are the screenshots of them. Yes, I'm a daredevil. Your point? After this happened and the new year started, the podcast went on a hiatus so that both Jake and Karina could deal with their personal stuff, but around February or March of that following year, they announced that they were going to be inviting a few guests onto their podcast when they returned. However, in order to get in, Jake and Karina need to accept you, and they decide what day you get featured on. However, they also let the guests decide the topic and guide the podcast through. When I sent in my application, they approved it. I felt that this was finally time for me to be featured on a podcast. I couldn't wait for the day to come. I was excited, but that happiness and joy would eventually end. Well, first of all, I needed to join a Discord for this, which I did, despite the fact that, at that moment, I was taking a 2-week break from Discord in order to work on my mental health. So, what I requested for my podcast topic was taking walks and enjoying being in nature and that kind of thing. I did a lot of that over the lockdown as a way to not be cooped up in my house, as we had to abide by safety rules that some people were still too stupid to understand. Some time would pass, and I was really looking forward to the day I would be featured on Jake and Karina's podcast. I even remember the exact date, April 18th. I had been visualizing about all the different things I wanted to talk about and the sort. And then, April of that year, I had arrived and some news about the podcast was revealed. And it was, well, very disappointing to me. Once April came in, right before I was leaving on my spring break trip to visit colleges, I got an announcement out of what was basically nowhere that Jake and Karina were completely canceling the podcast entirely and leaving everyone who hadn't had an episode yet to be in the dust, for lack of better terms. And to make matters worse, I don't think either of them actually apologized to us. So eventually, April 18th came, and it could have been me recording a podcast episode about walking into the outside world, and instead it was, actually I think it was just me taking a walk by myself to Target to get more iTunes gift cards, but that is beside the point. They also made it very clear that they would not be bringing the podcast back in the future, which I kinda expected. And that's the story on how I got ghosted on potentially joining in on my first opportunity of actually being featured on a podcast. Interestingly enough, a week or two before I started typing this, one of the two of them announced that they were actually going to be doing their own podcast that would be acting as a solo podcast, and it would be starting some point around September. If you somehow get this message, best of luck out there. Also, while I was working on this script, I actually looked up the podcast I've been talking about for the past, I don't even know how many minutes, and from what I was able to find, the entire podcast is just gone. Jake and Karina don't have the channel in their list, and upon doing a YouTube search, it isn't even showing up. it's like it never even existed. Like it was just a memory. Now, where do my stances on podcasts lie now? Well, that whole thing with Jake and Karina didn't stop me, and as of now, I want to start looking out to see if I might be able to have that chance to be featured on a podcast again. I will keep looking and hope that one day, the day will come. Dare to dream. When I was in my first year of college, I explained this whole situation to one of my co-curricular professors and her assistant, who was someone I knew from a school club, and they said that they were hosting their own podcast as well, but I declined because I am not very knowledgeable in Marvel Comics. Another thing that was when I was looking at colleges, around the same time as the Jake and Karina story, my top choice at college had its own podcast studio, and that was one of the main things drawing me in. But unfortunately, since that didn't pan out, that idea went off my mind for the longest time. As for now, I will continue my search, but lately I have been very interested in this podcast about idol anime that is hosted by two people. If you know what kind of communities I've been hanging out in since the spring, this should be a no-brainer on what I'm talking about. And who knows? Maybe I'll start listening to more podcasts again in the future. Again, as I always say, the future tells that tale. Anyway, that's going to be where I'm going to end this rendition of Stories of History SupernovaBlade. If you enjoyed it, you can like, comment, or subscribe, the whole shebang. Anyway, this has been SupernovaBlade, and goodbye.